Like most of you, I'm really excited that Donald Trump was elected president. I really do believe that he wants to make America great again. Now, whether he can do that or not is another question. I really believe that in order to do that, he and most of us need to have an understanding of how our economic system works. Now, I know most of us are very busy and don't have time to really study economics, but I'm going to give you an understanding of how our economic system works in about 10 minutes. So here goes. One time I was on vacation in Chicago and visited the Museum of Science and Industry. There was an exhibit there on banking, and it had models of various banks through history, and the very first model was a Babylonian temple. And the exhibit explained how banking began in Babylon. Well, I researched that for many years and found that to be true. And I'm going to give you an explanation of how the Babylonian banking system worked, because our banking system today is patterned after that and works basically the same way. It's known as fractional reserve banking. In Babylon, the medium of exchange, or money, was grain, wheat. When people wanted to make a purchase, they just provided the appropriate amount of wheat. Also in Babylon was a grain bank where people could store excess wheat they didn't need at the time. And so people would deposit their grain in the grain bank, and the grain banker would issue them a receipt for the wheat. Over time, the tendency developed that when people wanted to eat, plant, or spend their wheat, rather than go to the grain bank and get the wheat out, if they wanted to spend the wheat, they would simply spend the receipt. The receipt circulated throughout the Babylonian economy as if they were the money, or medium of exchange. Now remember, the medium of exchange was not the receipts, it was the wheat. But the receipts circulated as if they were the medium of exchange. You wanted to buy a pair of shoes, you took the appropriate amount of receipt to the shoemaker to buy shoes or whatever. Well, the grain banker also had the habit of loaning out his grain at interest. Somebody needed grain to plant a crop. They'd go to the grain banker, say they'd borrow 10 bushels of grain, and at harvest time they would repay him 11 bushels of grain. He could earn a little interest off the grain that he had. Well, one day somebody came to the grain banker to borrow grain. And the borrower said, well, I don't really want this grain to eat or to plant. I want to spend the grain. So rather than just give me the grain to plant or eat, since that's not what I want to do, could you just give me a receipt for the grain? And the grain banker at that time thought, all of my grain is already loaned out at interest, but all this other grain sits here that already has receipts issued against it. Who would know if I had more receipts outstanding for grain than I had grain? And so what he did, he simply sat down and wrote out a second receipt for a unit of grain that already had a receipt issued against it. He basically created money, or medium of exchange, as a debt accounting entry and loaned it into existence. Now, this didn't cost him anything, and nothing really existed there. It was purely imaginary. But off of this receipt that he issued, he could earn interest. Now just think, at some point the person that borrowed this receipt had to pay the grain banker back. Now how would he pay the grain banker back? He could pay the grain banker back in one of two ways. He could pay him back with wheat, in which case the grain banker had more reserves that he could issue more receipts on. And remember, our banking system is called fractional reserve, which means there's not 100% reserve, but the banker has some fraction of the reserves that he makes loans on. Let's just say, for example, for every receipt the grain banker issued, for every 5 receipts he issued, he had 1 unit of grain. That would be a fractional reserve ratio of 1 to 5. Now, when you paid the grain banker back, if you paid him in wheat, he had more receipts. He had more reserves that he could issue receipts on. But if you paid him back in his own receipts, what are those worth to him? Nothing. So he simply tears them up and throws them away. And that's how today banks create and destroy money in their everyday operations. They create money by making loans. When they do that, new loans or new money is created. When the loan is repaid, the money is destroyed. It goes out of existence. But off of that debt accounting entry that cost the bank nothing to create, the bank earned interest. Now, the fatal flaw in our money system today is that all money is created in that way. It's loaned into existence at interest and must be paid back to the money creator with interest. That means that the money supply must constantly expand to create new money as interest comes due on old loans. Now, think about it. Is our money supply constantly expanding? You can go on the internet and look and see what the money supply is and has been over time. It is constantly expanding. Now, the system that we have, what it does is it puts future generations in deeper and deeper debt to the money creator. And it also destroys the savings of anybody that has money by causing constant inflation. It inflates the money supply or makes it bigger, which makes the value of the money less. Now, that's how our money system works. That's why the United States government is $20 trillion in debt. Now, think about this. People constantly tell us that when the government deficit spends, it creates new money. Well, how can that be true? It can't be true. If the government was creating the money, the government wouldn't be in debt. The Federal Reserve banking system, which is privately owned by the international bankers, creates the money supply of the United States, and then the hardworking people of the United States are taxed to pay interest to the international bankers on money they created simply as a debt accounting entry, exactly the same way the Babylonian grain banker created money. Now, Milton Friedman, a Nobel Prize winning economist, said that the solution to that is that rather than have these private individuals be given the privilege of creating the nation's money supply, have the federal government create the money supply. That's how most of us believe it's done anyway. And then they could spend the money into existence, and with a proper balance of government money creation and taxation, supply the people with money to carry on commerce. That way there would be no national debt, taxation could be a lot lower, and we wouldn't have the fatal flaw of constantly having to expand the money supply to pay interest as it comes due. Now, my name's Charlie Fuqua. I've written the book, God's Law, The Only Political Solution. And in that book, I explain this money supply and this money system and the solution to it. Unless we get back to following God's laws, we are not going to solve the problems in our nation. Thank you for listening.